So, dear members, dear colleagues, welcome to this meeting of the Subcommittee on Disability and Multiple and Intersectional Discrimination. I hereby declare the meeting open. So today we have the honor of organizing a joint hearing with the Parliamentary Network Women Free from Violence. I would like to welcome all network members present today, as well as members of the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination. First of all, can we adopt the agenda? Thank you very much. The agenda is adopted. Can we approve the draft minutes of the meeting held on April 27th in a hybrid manner? Thank you. Adopted. So, let's now start with our hearing on preventing and combating violence against women with disabilities, held in the framework of the preparation of a report on this topic by Ms. Fresco-Rolfo from Monaco. This hearing is held jointly with the Parliamentary Network Women Free from Violence, and there is a live webcast on its Facebook page. I would also like to welcome persons who attend the hearing online today. So we have the privilege of having both online and with us guest speakers who agreed to participate in this important meeting. Ms. Reem Alsalem, Ms. Helen Portal, Ms. Elisa Rojas, and Ms. Claire Desaint. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and you are here with us today. So before we start with the hearing, I will give the floor to Ms. Sita Gurmai, the General Rapporteur of the Assembly on Violence Against Women and Coordinator of the Parliamentary Network Women Free from Violence, for a few introductory words. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very busy day, dear Chairperson, because we started in the morning with a public hearing, full house, I would say. So I think it was really great that so many of you could do it. And of course, I just wanted to inform you that the President of Grevio has been also with us, because that was a hearing on the Istanbul Convention. And of course, thank you very, very much to showing support to women of Iran. I know a lot of you could make the common picture in the hemicycle and outside the plenary session as well. The Istanbul Convention clearly mentions the situation of women with disabilities. The principle of non-discrimination is presented in its Article 4.3, which stresses that protection and support should be accessible to all. Grevio does monitor the response by state parties to the Convention to Violence Against Women with Disabilities and reports on it. It will therefore be of importance to look at its country reports in order to identify good practices. By the way, Iris mentioned this morning that 22 reports has been done and 7 in process, so it means that they are really doing an amazing job. So thanks for all the experts who are dedicated for this issue. Unfortunately, Grevio could not send one of its members this afternoon due to the ongoing session in parallel with ours. But I also would like to inform you that we should be able to organize a second hearing with the participation of Grevio during one of the next part sessions. I hope that you will follow us again. In the meantime, we have today a great panel representing UN, NGOs and activists, and I really look forward to the contributions by our guests today. I'm really pleased. Which I'm convinced that is going to be very valuable for the preparation of my great friend by Beatrice Fresco-Rolfo. She has been doing the job before, and I could learn a lot from you, so merci beaucoup, cher collègue.
Thank you very much. So we will start with a video message from Ms. Reem Alsalem, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences since 2021, who could unfortunately not be with us in Strasbourg today, as she is starting an official visit to South Korea. So she wanted to contribute to this hearing and send us a video message presenting her work on this issue, as well as some recommendations and key elements in UN instruments. Please, I will ask for it to be played now. We have no sound, so please, the technicians, could they help us?
Bonjour. Je remercie le Conseil de l'Europe de m'avoir invité.
Hello, I'd like to thank the Council of Europe for inviting me to this very important hearing. I'm delighted to see that the Council has dedicated a session to this important issue, namely violence against women with disabilities, their challenges and the solutions we can bring. We already know that women with disabilities experience aggravated forms of discrimination and specific violations of their rights. The right to legal capacity. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities recognizes the significance of such forms of discrimination against women and children with disabilities, since they are at higher risk of exclusion and discrimination. Equality before the law is central to human rights. It is described as the right to have rights. It is enshrined in many key international human rights frameworks, including CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence and Discrimination Against Women, since 1979. While many states have adopted legal frameworks to guarantee equality of rights between women and men, only a few have taken concrete actions to address the specific needs of women and girls with disabilities and to enhance their participation and to dismantle the barriers they face. Owing to gender stereotypes and gender-based violence, women with disabilities often cannot enjoy their full agency and make their own decisions. As such, they are particularly at risk of being placed under substitute decision-making regimes without justification. For example, women with leprosy-related disabilities are often deprived of rights such as the right to property. Furthermore, in most countries, women with disabilities are not given the possibility to make autonomous decisions about their own reproductive and sexual health, leading to highly discriminatory and harmful practices. In general, women with disabilities face compounded barriers to access to services in an equal and inclusive manner, to enjoy their fundamental rights and to fully enjoy their life. This situation is in large part due to the fact that disability has a low visibility in laws, policies and practices. For example, women with discriminations are 3 times more likely to have unmet needs for healthcare, 3 times more likely to be illiterate, twice less likely to be employed, and twice less likely to use the internet. Moreover, women with disabilities are at heightened risk of suffering sexual violence compared to those without disabilities. Due to their disability, they are impacted more strongly by the low quality of certain services or lack of access to them, in particular when it comes to health. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed these underlying inequalities and exacerbated the situation of women and girls with disabilities. For them, the everyday obstacles, such as physical accessibility, obstacles to implementing basic hygiene measures, affordability of healthcare, limitations on health insurance, and discriminatory laws and stigma can be life-threatening in the midst of a pandemic. People with disabilities face the same risk of infection from COVID-19 as the rest of the population. However, in many cases, the danger posed by the virus is compounded by many other factors. In addition to the disruption to essential services and support, pre-existing health conditions in some people with disabilities can leave them more at risk of developing serious health conditions. In conflict or emergency situations as well, people with disabilities are amongst the most adversely affected, sustaining disproportionately higher rates of morbidity and mortality. Last week, I presented a report to the General Assembly on the intersection between violence against women and girls, climate change, and environmental degradation. This report underlines the fact that climate change and environmental degradation further exacerbate the risk of violence against women and girls with disabilities and excludes them even more from decision-making fora. Effective participation is in fact another area where there are many challenges for women with disabilities. Although participation is essential for participating in processes that affect their lives, such as preventing and response to violence. Historically, this imbalance in power means that women with disabilities have been faced with many obstacles in participating in the decision-making process. They've had fewer opportunities to join civil society and advocacy groups. Acknowledging this situation, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities requires states to take all appropriate measures to ensure their full development, advancement, and empowerment. The Convention indicates that states must take steps to eliminate the barriers that prevent their participation in public decision-making and must ensure that all participatory mechanisms and bodies take into account both disability and gender-related factors, as well as the complex interrelationship between them. Finally, states must establish measures to guarantee that the perspectives of women and girls with disabilities are fully taken into account and that they will not suffer any reprisals for expressing their viewpoints and concerns, especially in relation to sexual and reproductive rights, gender-based violence, and sexual violence. However, prioritizing women with disabilities as a group is not enough. On top of gender inequality, we must look further into the situation of most marginalized groups among people with disabilities, taking into account other factors of discrimination: race, national origin, social situation, political opinion, etc. States must integrate a gender perspective in policies and programs, addressing the discrimination faced on intersecting grounds by women and girls with a disability, because they live in multiple realities. Available data shows that women and girls with disabilities are at increased risk of violence. Programs aimed at ending violence against women have often failed to take into account the needs of women and girls with disabilities and to fund these programs appropriately. In the area of access to health services, given their importance, states must establish non-discriminatory ethical medical guidelines to protect people with disabilities. The World Health Organization has issued disability-inclusive guidelines that are in line with international human rights conventions. States must also support the decision-making by persons with disabilities, premised on the fact that men and women are equal. Finally, when it comes to conflict areas, and since Resolution 1325 of the Security Council on Women, Peace and Security, Member States are encouraged to increase the representation of women at all decision-making levels. More attention should be given to the role that women with disabilities can play in preventing conflict, which is insufficiently taken into account to this day. I hope to have made a useful contribution to your discussion. Thank you for your kind attention.
It was really interesting. So we have with us in the room Ms. Helen Portal, Advocacy and Policy Officer at Inclusion Europe. You know that our subcommittee has a long-standing cooperation with Inclusion Europe, and you will tell us about violence against women with disabilities living in institutions and forced sterilisation. This is a very delicate issue we have to address all together, so we're looking forward to your contribution. You have the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Helen and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Officer from Inclusion Europe. So Inclusion Europe represents people with intellectual disabilities and their families. We have 77 member organizations in 38 countries in Europe, and 1/3 of these organizations are self-advocacy organizations. It also means that in our board, we have members with intellectual disabilities. So I would like to first start presenting to you the study we did published in 2018 on called Life After Violence, on how women with intellectual disabilities cope with the violence they experienced in institutions. So it was done in 2 years and in the Netherlands. And to do this research, my colleague went to several institutions to speak with women with intellectual disabilities and care workers. Sometimes the discussion wasn't easy, and to start this discussion, they started the conversation with drawings on cards, and then people were more inclined to talk following those drawings. So the reason we did this report is because we wanted to know what violence women experience and what violence is specific to institutions, how these women deal with the violence, what happened when they move to smaller institutions and out of institution, if they were able to develop life included in the community, and what support they had had. So as it was mentioned before, intersectionality when it comes to women with intellectual disability makes it an aggravating factor of disempowerment and vulnerability for women, and they are an easier target for violent behaviors. So what happened is that a lot of women in these institutions did not have many people in their lives they could count on. And for the purpose of the study, we identified 3 types of violence. So direct violence, which is when someone intentionally hurts you. The careless attitudes, when someone is hurt because the care provided is not well done. And structural violence. The structural violence is when someone is hurt because of societal structures, the system, the power of control, the rules and the regulations. So what we need to understand is that there are different conceptions of violence, and there seems to be a gap between what women with intellectual disabilities experience as violence and the perceptions and intention of the support staff. So while most of the support staff was in their role to care and not to hurt anyone, the care provided sometimes was experienced as violence. And what we found in this report is that, first of all, there's a big underreporting issue. Many women with intellectual disabilities don't talk about the violence they experience because they are afraid. They are afraid they're not going to be believed, that they will be hurt if they speak, but also that they lose the care they get if they speak. So what we observed is that needing the support makes those women more vulnerable, and violence is still a very taboo topic because first, for women who live in institution, it's very difficult to establish a relation of trust with the support person because sometimes women have changed from one institution to another several times, and there's also a turnover of staff in the institutions. And sometimes it's the support workers who felt they were not qualified to speak about violence, and they would redirect the victims of violence to therapists, for example, and this made the women in the institution who were trying to express the violence they were victims of as if they were not listened to, or as if the person didn't really care what had happened to them. And last aspect is that information isn't adapted. So women are not told that they can report violence, and when they realize it, it's sometimes too late. When it comes to the perpetrator of violence, what some of the women told us is that when the perpetrator is a person with disability, then his attitude is justified because he has a disability. And when it's not a person with disability, then they are not being believed because they have a disability anyway, so they don't understand what they are speaking about. And then it's about the procedures after. When they're being interrogated at the police station, it's often unadapted to people with intellectual disabilities. It's too long. You can't have a person to support you. And sometimes the questions are strange. So it's difficult to speak during those interrogations. There's also a lot of fear. I guess it's the case for every woman trying to speak about violence. But this situation of disability makes it difficult because, as I said, you have to establish this situation of trust before to be able to speak about it. And they are often scared to lose what they have. For example, there was this woman who spoke, and when she spoke about the violence she was experiencing, they fired the person in charge of her, so this was one of the situations. They are also scared that they will be sent to psychiatric wards, for example, and many women are depressed. And for example, there was this woman who gave a testimony and said that she wanted to go outside to take some fresh air, but to go outside they had to fill in papers, and it took a few days, so she broke a window and she was accused of bad behavior. So what was recommended after this report is that education is very important. Women need to know about their rights, and this includes women with intellectual disabilities, but the problem is, as you may know, many people with intellectual disabilities are put into separated or segregated education settings, so they do not have access to the same education, and especially when it comes to sexual and reproductive rights. So this is why inclusion is key, and it's part of the work we try to do at Inclusion Europe. And there's also, as long as institutions still exist, a need to talk about violence, to listen to the experience of the people, provide easy-to-read information so that they can understand what is violence, and of course work with self-advocates and work with people who live in institutions together with them to define what is best. So for the support that should be provided after violence, it's very important because it makes a crucial difference on how they can later perceive violence, understand what it is, and how to behave. So many women still don't get the support because they don't have a person they can trust. They are afraid of retaliation from the service provider. They fear they are not going to be believed once again. They are afraid to be hurt, and they don't want to move again because moving from to another institution or to another unknown place is sometimes also frightening. And sometimes they just don't know, so they think that what happened is normal. I would also like to speak quickly about forced sterilisation in the EU. So the European Disability Forum did a report on forced sterilisation, and it reveals that it's still existing and widespread in the EU because there are still 14 member states where forced sterilisation is allowed by law for people with disabilities. Forced sterilisation of minors is allowed in 3 countries. It's not allowed for 9 countries, and there are 4 countries where we don't have the information. And in 9 countries, it can be allowed by a judge in court. So, yeah, what I would say is that violence on women with disabilities is much higher than on women without disability, and it's already too much. The question of legal capacity certainly doesn't help women to be more independent, included, and to report this violence. And when we started the research in the Netherlands at the time, 33% of women without disabilities were victims of violence, and 61 women with disabilities, so twice. And yeah, that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. So we will now invite our next guest speaker, Ms. Elisa Rojas, who is a lawyer in Paris as well as a feminist activist, to make her presentation. It is an honor to have you with us today. Ms. Rojas, you will focus on how to prevent and combat the invisibilization of women with disabilities in our societies, and of course its connection with the fight against gender-based violence. This unacceptable stance marginalizes these women, and we found that women with disabilities were more than twice as likely to experience violence and abuse compared to those without disabilities. So you have the floor.
Vous avez la parole, madame.
Passe.
Elle est en ligne.
Allow us some time, please.
Patience, s'il vous plaît.
Est-ce que là, vous m'entendez? Est-ce que là, vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? Yes, you have the floor. Thank you. Before I start, it is important to give you clarifications. I'm not a researcher. I'm a lawyer by profession, but not a criminal law lawyer, although my job allows me to have a reflection. I cannot speak here about my professional experience or have a scientific approach. I'm a disabled person myself, and hence the fact that I was actually asked to talk today. I'd like to talk about the paradox regarding violence against disabled women, because they are overexposed to violence, although those violence are made invisible. One of the most important difficulties when we want to talk about violence against disabled women is that it is badly documented. There is a dearth of figures and solid statistical data, which makes it very difficult to implement a public policy of prevention and adapted fight against this phenomenon. At an international level, the awareness is greater, but the studies that we have are quite old and sectorials. In France, which I know well, the problem of statistical data is very important in the field of disability and violence against women. The last report of the Senate in 2019 deals with violence against disabled women, recognizes that we have a dearth of data on this phenomenon. But when there are figures, we all say that it confirms an overexposure of disabled women vis-à-vis gender-based violence and other types of violence, including sexual violence, but it's not visible in the public arena. Disabled women are not very often taken into account in public policies. They are not represented in the media, in fictions, and today the media celebrate the Me Too anniversary, but there's a dearth of disabled women in this movement, whereas they are overrepresented in the population of victims of violence. We can ask ourselves why. For me, there is a context which is conducive to violence against disabled women, but also the fact that they are made invisible. And I would like to give you some reflections to explain this context. We have to be aware of the over-solicitation of the notion of vulnerability to explain that disabled women are overexposed to violence. Very often, we highlight the specific vulnerability related to the handicap. This we present it as an obvious matter and the main cause of violence. But we have to be very prudent as regards this context. We need to take into account vulnerability and its consequences. Handicap can, of course, be a hurdle and give the perpetrators more margin of maneuver. Handicap can have repercussions on communication and overexposes disabled women vis-à-vis violence. Having said that, the very notion of vulnerability should not essentialize disabled women. It would be very dangerous to say that disabled women are only vulnerable. The mobilization of the vulnerability notion should not make it that we forget the importance of this vulnerability for disabled women. The dependence and their vulnerability is organized, which I mean that they live in a family and institutional closed circuit. Financial autonomy of disabled women is very difficult. We know that they have very little access to education, studies, employment, that discriminations are very important, and we know that they find it difficult to get access to autonomous housing because of a lack of housing policies for disabled people. And they also find it difficult to find help and aid which would be adapted, and sometimes they really need them because of administrative red tape and other problems. All these problems make it that the independence of disabled women is organized, so they are very dependent on their couple, and that is conducive to violence. And they are endangered via institutionalization. When they are committed to an institution, we know that they live in closed houses, and their daily life is governed by rules they are supported by many professionals who have the authority with very little external control, and the fact that they are committed to institutions make it that they can be subject to violence. This is a reality which is very difficult to admit in some countries, such as France. France has built its public policies around the fact of committing people to institutions. Another important point, representations in the fact that violences are made invisible. There are important representations around handicap that play a major part in the reticence to recognize violence against handicapped women. And disabled women are not seen as fully fledged adults and women. They are not supposed to have an adult sexuality. When the issue of sexuality is put, it's only in terms of control by their family, needing measures, and that is a violation to their integrity or rights, such as sterilizations. Very often they are disqualified as partners, as mothers, as adults, being entitled to harness their body and their reproductive rights. And the handicapped body is a body that exists as an object of care, but not as a subject. It is considered not to be useful because it is not productive. It is also a body which should not be submitted to domination. Hence the fact that it is very necessary to deal with violence. And disabled women are very often dominated, but are at a crossroad of two oppression systems, the one based on gender and the other one based on handicap. Another idea, a very negative idea, which prevent violence from being visible, is that disabled women are supposed to be protected from all types of violence by their family and by institutions. Very often we consider that their family members are heroes and benevolent because they support them. And very often violence comes from the members of the family and from institutions. Very often these violences are supposed to be, are seen and considered to be uncontrollable. And one of the main difficulties is for these women to identify violence. Disabled women do not have a lot of information on their sexuality, contraception, sexually transmitted diseases, violence, and find it very difficult to get access to medical care, gynecologists, and so forth. Representations I talked to you about earlier are a burden upon society as a whole, but on the women themselves. They are excluded very often from the list of victims of violence, and they think they are not concerned. Then we need to think about the notion of consent or intimacy, which can be absent for many disabled women because there is a lack of information, because they are only aware of forced intimacy, and the limits imposed upon themselves are very difficult to identify. They find it very difficult to report violence since the types of violence are not very well known from themselves. When they have signs of sufferings, of trauma, we think that they are a manifestation of their disability instead of thinking about suspected violence, and the access to police or the judicial system is not adapted, and very often there is a lack of accessibility in terms of emergency housing. By way of conclusion, I would like my speech to be used so that you understand that society imposes upon disabled women existence conditions and representations which would transform them into privileged praise and guarantee impunity and doesn't guarantee impunity for perpetrators. Training has to be carried out for women, by women, because we are not only talking about raising awareness amongst non-disabled people. It is indispensable to create the conditions of equality, autonomy, and to make sure that disabled women really become subjects and not objects. They should be helped in the decision-making process. They should become independent from a financial point of view, from a housing point of view, and also, once and for all, we need to encourage this disinstitutionalization as a tool in order to fight against violence against disabled women. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Vous êtes très précise. Félicitations. So our last speaker present in the room today is Ms. Claire Desaint, Vice President of the Association Femmes pour le dire, Femmes pour agir. So you will tell us about the work of your association, COVID-19 and violence against women with disabilities. You have the floor. Thank you.
Je vous remercie beaucoup de m'avoir invité.
Thank you for inviting me. I already participated in one of your meetings 3 years ago when I spoke about violence against disabled women and the work carried out by my association. It is called Femmes pour le dire, Femmes pour agir. It was created in 2003. It aims at fighting against all forms of discriminations, and in particular the double discrimination we've talked about earlier, experienced by disabled women. We need to say loud and clear that we are women and citizens after all. But disability is an add-on, so to speak. But we need to consider that we are women first. And of course we need to fight against violence against girls and disabled women. There is a report of the Council of Europe saying that 80% of disabled women are victims of violence. We've actually created a hotline with a dedicated telephone number with people who have been trained to listen to disabled women subject to violence. Then we have a social and judicial care if necessary. Disabled women need to organize themselves in a specific environment, in a social culture which is not conducive to overcome hurdles in order to obtain housing, employment, social life, and healthcare. I was asked to talk about the consequences of COVID-19. In fact, the impact was greater for disabled women. But once again, we have very little data as regards the impact of COVID-19 on disabled women. We have no figures about deaths and illnesses due to COVID-19 amongst disabled people. We have no gender-based approach in the responses given to the crisis. There was a problem to satisfy basic needs since healthcare professionals had to work in hospitals. They did not really get access to healthcare, so therefore there was an impact on their health, on sexual and reproductive health as well. In hospitals, for instance, when they were pregnant or they had to give birth, they had nobody to look after them, which was very difficult for a person who is disabled, but nobody could, from their family, could be present. There was also a loss of employment or income. Many disabled ladies worked in restaurants, for instance, but they were closed at the time. There was a decrease in public assistance. They did not get access to rehabilitation, to other types of types of health care. In France, we were allowed to go out for only an hour per day. It was very difficult for disabled people, of course. They were even more isolated because the members of their families could not visit them and support was less present. So it was very difficult for them. And also, I have to talk about invisibility in decision-making. No disabled women took part in scientific councils, whereas they could have provided their opinion. And women associations and feminist associations were not really consulted in the decisions that were made. So once again, disability has been forgotten altogether. By way of conclusion, we saw that there was an increase in violence, and that applied to all women, not only disabled women, 33% increase in France. But as regards disabled women, the figures were even higher because the perpetrator very often is the husband or a member of the family, therefore even more difficult not to be subject to violence. So they were isolated, they couldn't come out because of the lockdown, so it was very difficult for them to flee. So, of course, they were victims of violence. They could talk about their problems to healthcare professionals, but there, during the lockdown, it was even more difficult for them. People committed to institutions were more endangered vis-à-vis violence, so that increased the risk of being submitted to violence. Then we have to talk about financial independence as well. Compensations were not actually given to the disabled person, but to the members of the family. During the pandemic, we organized assistance online, and we maintained our hotline. Less people were looked after, unfortunately. We thought that it was because the companion or the partner or the husband was also located in the same house. But having said that, after the lockdowns, there was a major increase of the calls and even more violence was recorded than before. So the people who worked for us heard very dreadful experiences from disabled women. Of course, we need gender-based statistical data. We need to classify the help services. They have to be considered as essential services. We need to provide information using different formats. The sign language in France has developed a lot, has increased on television, but there is a lack of other accessible media, and many disabled people were not aware of what was going on. We need to provide revenues and income to disabled women rather than the members of their family. And we need to make sure that they participate in the decision-making process during the pandemics as well. They really need to be included. I also want to talk about violence and what took place over the past 3 years. There has been a very interesting study carried out in Nouvelle-Aquitaine by the Observatory of Sexist and Sexual Violence called Victims of Violence, or rather women victims of violence in Nouvelle-Aquitaine. 178 questionnaires were devised, and 53% of the people who replied never talked about the violence they were subject to. And when they speak about it, they speak to members of their family, to a doctor or a social worker. A fourth of the women do not know when the violence actually started, and 16% of them say that they've always been victims of violence. Autistic women are even more vulnerable because they don't know what is violence, what is intimacy, benevolence. We can talk about 90% of autistic women being victims of violence, and 100% of the people in this study have actually tried to commit suicide. 90% say they were victims of verbal or psychological violence, 50% sexual violence, prostitution, rapes, and 80% of the professionals know at least one disabled woman victim of violence. I myself carried out awareness-raising campaigns in Loire-Atlantique in the west of France. We raised awareness amongst educators in institutions, and they all say that the rate of violence is very high. Professionals are not trained, and they don't know how to go about it. They find it very difficult to react. And amongst violence, half of them have to do with forced sexual intercourse. And more than half of them have declared they have been victims of incest. So in our association, we've devised a new questionnaire on the social networks to obtain statistical data in disabled girls, because we have very little data on the subject, and it's very important.
So we find that there's a lack of data on women and girls with disabilities, women who found themselves with a disability after situations of violence, so post-traumatic disability, suicides due to violence and to the dropping of charges, femicides. We're at 86 and counting in France to this day, and there's no data available about disabled women victims of femicide. A recent study gives us absolutely no data about disabled women. We don't have any data about sexual assault against underage disabled girls or disabled children victims of incest. So you see that there's a huge lack of data, as Elisa Rojas pointed out. So we have a listening service, a day and a half per week. We're trying to get more funding in order to be available more days a week. We have a specific website as well as a presence on social media. We have an escape game for young people to be able to identify discrimination. We have workshops. That aim at having social activities for disabled women. There's a book club, theatre, jewellery making, in order to show these women that they have skills, they have talents, there's a lot that they can do. So these workshops are very important for sociability. We do a lot of advocacy. We are in touch with various institutions. We organize conferences, forums. We give training, especially to law enforcement and the Bar Association in Paris. We are part of a number of feminist networks and disability networks, like the CFHE, the European Women's Lobby, and we cooperate with institutions such as the Ombudsman, the High Council for Equality, and various ministries. So we have a lot of work on our plate, and we have existed for 20 years, and these issues are increasingly talked about in France. When it comes to preventing violence, what we recommend is, of course, to train professionals, care professionals, but also training disabled people, disabled women themselves, because they're very often poorly informed of their rights. They're not aware that they can lodge a complaint, that they can go to the police. So this training needs to reach practitioners, but also women with disabilities. So practitioners, we mean medical staff, legal staff, law enforcement, etc. The control of institutions. There's very little control within institutions, and we also need to protect whistleblowers who report violence rather than questioning what they're saying. And a lot of institutions feel awkward because they're afraid that they might get a bad reputation. I want to talk about the Grenelle meeting. We had a large-scale Grenelle meeting on domestic violence, and there was a specific subgroup working on disabled women. And we had 3 measures, 2 of which are already in place, 1 which is currently being rolled out. One of these measures is a memo reminding the directors of institutions that they must be vigilant and must train their staff. A second action, which is the setting up across all French regions of a resource centre on sexual and emotional life and parenthood for disabled people. And the third action is online training for practitioners, for professionals. So our group is still working on this, and we're looking at the follow-up, because follow-up is extremely important. So unfortunately, COVID happened. Many institutions were very busy with other things, but it is important work, and we're keeping an eye on the follow-up.
Merci beaucoup. You are also very detailed, and your contribution is really invaluable. Thanks for the presentation also you've had with you. So, would our rapporteur for report, Ms. Beatrice Fresco-Rolfo, like to react or ask some questions? Please, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all our speakers for taking part in this hearing. It has been extremely interesting, and this gives me a lot of food for thought for the report that I'm currently drafting together with the committee on preventing and combating violence against women with disabilities. This type of violence is exacerbated by disability, and the aim of this report is making that visible. We talked a lot about visibility, and very often these women aren't listened to, which is, of course, extremely detrimental. What I would like to include in the report, and I hope you'll be able to answer me on this, I think that all discriminations against these women are a form of violence, and I would like them to be seen as such, as violence. So we heard the rapporteur. I'm not going to ask any questions because it was a recorded statement, but there was something she said which was very interesting. She talked about stigmatization and stereotypes, and she made a connection between environmental damage and an increased risk of violence against women with disabilities. And this is something that I would like to take up, and I would like more clarifications on this connection. So I will look into that. Mrs. Rojas, your background is admirable. You talked about difficulties in accessing education, housing, which is a form of violence, the dangers of placement in institutions. And on this topic, we voted a resolution on deinstitutionalization in April of this year. So this is an issue that we have been working on within this committee. The chair of the Equality Committee is there with me. You mentioned problems to do with the sexuality of women with disabilities, and I would like to come back to a couple of notions, if I may. You talked about the vulnerability of disabled women, which is socially constructed. This was a very interesting notion. And you also talked about empowering or restoring the empowerment of disabled women and making sure they can take part in decision-making processes. This is also very interesting. Now, I have a question about discrimination as violence. And I wanted to know, would it be interesting, in your opinion, for discrimination to be recognized as violence when we talk about discrimination against disabled people, or at least a disabled woman or girl. Shall I go on, or...? Right, I'll ask all of the questions I have. I'm not taking things in order. Mrs. Desaint, you mentioned the lack of data, of gender disaggregated data about the impact of COVID. It is true that when we see what you're talking about, it'd be very interesting to have this data, especially all the trouble NGOs have had to have access to disabled women and to be able to support them when they are victims of violence, especially during COVID. I think you had a lot of trouble with that. You've made recommendations to prevent violence. And I have a wider question also for Mrs. Portal. Mrs. Portal, I like the way you defined those three types of violence: direct violence, negligence, and cultural violence. And I think this is something we really need to think about. And this fear that the women experience, the fear of speaking out, the mapping of forced sterilization, this is very difficult to bear. It's something which is far too widespread. So I have a question for the two of you. Both of you talked about the need to control specialized institutions, to have an oversight of them. Do you think that disabled women in institutions, and women and girls, do you think they are at higher risk of violence? I think that's it for my questions.
Very much. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Rojas, who is away, and if she needs to make any comment, please.
Bien compris la question sur la...
Did I understand the question right? So you want to include the notion of discrimination as a form of violence? So as a lawyer, I will say that discrimination is a legal term with a very precise definition. And I think this is a notion which is enshrined in texts, which has a certain meaning, and which amounts to treating somebody differently for reasons that are listed. There's a very long list of grounds for discrimination, which is enshrined in French law and elsewhere. And I think we must not confuse denial of, say, a service for discriminatory motives, and not confuse that with the consequence of this discrimination on the people who are victim of it. And this consequence is a form of psychological violence. And I hope that one day courts will acknowledge this harm and will be able to compensate it better than they currently do, at least in a country like France. So I think that violence and discrimination are two distinct legal categories. So I understand where you're coming from, and I think that the consequence of discrimination is violence, but for me, those are two different notions. Yes, I saw the resolution on deinstitutionalization. It was very interesting. And in a country like France, I really think we need the support of international organizations, because they're currently our only allies to advocate for deinstitutionalization, for us disabled advocates. Because unfortunately, the oversight of institutions and the protection of whistleblowers, it is enshrined in law, it is in the legal framework, but it is never enough. And we need to think of a life for disabled people outside of institutions, beyond the control of institutions, by empowering them as much as possible, making them less dependent, and this will help us to protect them from violence. And if violence does happen, we will try to create conditions for them to be able to speak out.
Ms. Rojas, please, Ms. Portal, you have to add anything?
Oui, du coup...
Yes. regarding the oversight of specialized institutions, for me, there are two very important points. In terms of violence, first of all, we need to ban forced sterilization. And it is unbelievable that it still exists. Sometimes when it's not forced sterilization, it is forced contraception. That is a necessary condition to get a place in an institution. So the families have to, well, or the carers, they find ways of imposing forced contraception to gain a new client, a new customer, so a disabled person. And for me, that is linked to the notion of legal responsibility, which was taken away for very many people with intellectual disabilities. So these people don't have the right to decide. It is their guardian who makes these decisions, or their families. And sometimes, unfortunately, there's still this notion of protecting the disabled person, which is used as a justification to sterilize them or give them contraceptives without any further explanation sometimes. So this is a huge problem, obviously. And as regards deinstitutionalization, I fully agree with what Mrs. Desaint and Mrs. Rojas have said. It's necessary. But for people with intellectual disabilities, it's sometimes even more complicated because there's this whole notion of legal responsibility. And when things go wrong, or when the necessary support isn't available to make sure the person can live autonomously within the community, the responsibility falls to the families. So it's very often the mothers who have to take over. And I think there's not enough support and not enough possibility for the disabled women themselves to decide, because very often they are put away from society from the start. They're put in special schools, they're put in special institutions. So these work centres or these institutions we have in France. So they never have an opportunity of living a normal life within the community, and they have no idea what violence is. Which is why this report I spoke about is interesting, because it talks about specific structural violence happening within institutions, because there are rules imposed on disabled people and they don't even know, they're not even aware of the difference between care, say washing, and violence, which could be carried out by somebody from the family, by another resident, by a carer. It's very complicated.
Much, Ms. Desaint?
Oui. Yes. I have a lot to say about institutions. Bear in mind that in France there's this huge problem which was pointed out in the report, the UN report, where the UN Committee on the Implementation of the Convention looked into it. Most institutions are also controlled by big organizations of disabled persons. So this raises a problem in terms of deinstitutionalization, because these institutions make money. So the way things are structured in France is a bit complicated. In France, we also have a very medicalized approach to disability. It's not the approach taken by the UN. It's still very medicalized, and it is true that institutions are part and parcel of this approach. Also, I said that we lack data. We lack data about institutions. The most recent study 3 years ago on violence against women did not visit these institutions. We talked about this ahead of time. We wanted something to be done, but it wasn't possible, unfortunately, for these institutions. Even as far as other victims are concerned, there's only one question about the state of health of the person. So there's a great shortcoming in terms of data, and I think it would be very interesting to carry out a large-scale study Europe-wide about violence against disabled women in institutions. Now, we do know a number of things because a pilot project was carried out in Ile-de-France called Andi Gynéco, and it was found that disabled women didn't have access to generalist healthcare, for instance, in the field of gynecology. So, since surgeries aren't always accessible, gynecologists come to institutions to provide gynecological care, and then there's a relationship of trust that is established, and then very often the women start talking about the violence they have experienced. So this has been a successful pilot project, and we're thinking about expanding it because it should provide a lot of data. Midwives have played a very important part in this project, and this is quite new, and it should enable us to have better access to institutions. Of course, the directors of the institutions need to accept this intervention by gynecologists and midwives coming into institutions to provide care. Thank you very much.
Question to our guest speakers, dear colleagues, dear friends. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you, ladies, for your report and for your speeches. I was very infected because I didn't expect these things, you know. My question is, are younger women more affected, handicapped women more affected, or victims of violence, or elderly women who are in retirement homes? So, because you know, I have many contacts to the elderly people, and I got to know that they are very often contacted by violence, you know. So that's my question to the women.
Thank you very much. Anybody else, please, would like to pose a question? Okay. So, yes, please. Ms. Pett, yes.
Merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to warmly thank all our speakers. I was appalled and very moved by what you explained to us, and I wanted to give you my fullest sympathy. Now, I heard several times that there was a lack of data as far as France was concerned, and I wanted to know, do you have figures for other countries maybe than France? If that is not the case, I mean, I fully understand that such data is not collected in France, but it would be interesting to know if maybe we had data from another country saying we have this or that way of obtaining figures on these points. I would also like to recall that even though things take a certain time in France, we have finally separated the disability benefit. I was one of the first to advocate for this, in order for it to be paid directly to the disabled woman, especially in the context of domestic violence, so that if and when it happens, and it does happen, unfortunately, very frequently, so that these women are able to leave their violent partner and still be able to support themselves. So this question about data, and I also really wanted to thank our speakers for all their hard work.
Very much. So we're out of time, so you could have a final round of 1 minute each, if you like. Ms. Desaint?
Oui, alors,
yes. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the questions. So I'll reply to the last question first. Yes, as regards data, it's a general lack of data. It's not just France. It's the case across most countries. Maybe we need to collect data across all European countries. Furthermore, when it comes to paying the disability benefit directly to the disabled woman and not to her household. We had to work a lot on this to achieve it, in order to ensure that the disabled women were no longer dependent on their partner, to make them financially independent. Well, it's not huge sums, but it's better than before, when it was calculated depending on the income of their partner. I'm so sorry, I forgot.
Ah oui. Oui. Oui, tout à fait. Alors nous, dans notre écoute, nous avons fait des statistiques en fonction de l'âge.
Well, we do have data disaggregated by age, and people who call are mostly aged between 30 and 50. The younger women are probably not quite aware of the violence they're experiencing. And as regards older women in care homes, that is a different subject, and it's probably very important as well.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Portal.
Mrs. Portal, thank you. Regarding data, I fully agree with Mrs. Desaint. We have very little. I referred to data from the Netherlands, whereby 33% of victims of violence, women victims of violence, and 61% of disabled women who are victims of violence. But we don't really have a lot of data. And to come back to the issue of institutions, there's a lot of violence there as well. And when we carry out censuses or phone research, this type of study is not carried out in institutions, because institutions aren't viewed as being people's domiciles, and this is hugely problematic. And as regards the benefit, the disability benefit, let me come back to the notion of legal discernment, because it's very important. It means that you can have your financial independence, you can have a bank account, which is not the case of people with an intellectual disability. As regards older disabled people, in several countries, there's a cut-off age at around 60, around the age of 60, when you're no longer viewed as disabled, but you're viewed as old, so you fall into a different category. And in the case of violence, and I'm sure there are victims of violence in that age group. We know that there's violence in institutions and in care homes, but as regards data, we don't have any. I'm so sorry.
Miss Rojas, do you have something to add, just for 30 seconds?
Oui, alors.
Regarding age, as we know, unfortunately, this begins in childhood for disabled girls, and it never stops until a very old age. So what is at issue here is the type of disability and the degree of dependence. These could be aggravating factors. Everything is very well explained in a report of the Senate in France in 2019. It's a worldwide problem. And what does exist is mostly international. And as regards the disability benefit paid to women, I will recall, as Ms. Desaint said, that this has been a very long and difficult fight carried by advocates, by disabled women themselves, and we have not been very much supported from the start. It has been a very long and difficult fight.
And a very brief final comment from our General Rapporteur and Coordinator, Zita Gurmai.
Thank you very much. I just would like to tell that...
Je voulais simplement vous dire que c'est quelque chose qu'il conviendra de digérer. Le sujet est très difficile et nous n'avons pas tellement parlé de traumatisme pour l'instant, mais les effets post-traumatiques sur les enfants, il faut y penser, et sur les femmes plus jeunes ou plus âgées. Donc c'est un sujet important et je suis convaincu que la rapporteure va rédiger un excellent rapport Madame Fresco, et votre rapport aidera à vraiment évoluer. Nous avons du pain sur la planche, certes.
Concerning this topic, and I believe that we really need to continue the fight to have the invisible disabled woman should be visible, because that's what we are all fighting for. So, dear Chairperson, I was very pleased with your invitation and to co-chair with you this absolutely important event, so a little hard for all of you.
Thank you, Zita, for your contribution. So I'm grateful that our guest speakers took time to participate in this hearing. Thank you very much for being with us. Also, Ms. Rojas, on a hybrid manner. So I would like to ask you to authorize me to propose the date and place of next meeting in due course. Thank you, dear colleagues. Last, I would like to thank the interpreters. Merci à tous pour votre participation.
Thank you for your participation. La réunion est levée.